Hello, I am Eli Adashi, Professor of Medical Science at Brown University and host of Medscape One-on-One. Joining me today is Dr. Paul Offit to discuss his latest book, Deadly Choices: How the Anti-Vaccine Movement Threatens Us All. Dr. Offit is the Maurice R. Hilleman Professor of Vaccinology and Chief of the Division of Infectious Diseases at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Welcome.
Thank you.
It's great to have you. What led you to undertake this significant project?
I think we're at a tipping point, and it worries me. The tipping point is evidenced by outbreaks the likes of which we haven't seen recently. So, for example, we have a whooping cough outbreak in California that's bigger than anything we've seen since 1947. We've had mumps epidemics in the Midwest in 2006. Again, in the Northeast this past year, the most recent one involved 1,500 people, leaving several people deaf. We've had outbreaks of bacterial meningitis, the preventable kind, Haemophilus influenza type B, because parents chose not to vaccinate their children. We have had measles epidemic in 2008 and continue to have sporadic measles epidemics, most recently in Minnesota, because people are choosing not to vaccinate their children. And so you're starting to see these vaccine-preventable diseases come back, these once historic diseases come back, and it's hard to watch. I'm trying to sound a warning bell.
So it's an ongoing advocacy effort, really in support of vaccinating children. Do you sense that we're gaining, that you're having an impact? Are we turning the tide? How do you feel about that?
I think it's the good news and the bad news. I think the good news is that the media, certainly the mainstream media, has gotten much more responsible about covering this subject. I mean, it used to be that they would tell two sides of a story when only one side was supported by the science. So, for example, the vaccines cause autism debate. That's not true anymore. Mainstream media is much better about this. Even entertainment television, Larry King Live, Oprah, have started to back away from this. The problem is that there's been a lot of residual damage. I mean, a most recent study that was reported at the Pediatric Academic Society's meeting showed that 4 of 10 parents now are choosing to delay or withhold one or more vaccines for their children. So I think that's the fallout from all this.
What was it that triggered the anti-vaccine movement in the first place? Was there a seminal event, a point in time that launched this new effort?
I think there was, and I think in the birth of the modern American anti-vaccine movement occurred on April 19th, 1982, and that was associated with a 1-hour documentary. It appeared on a local NBC affiliate in Washington, D.C. It was called DPT Vaccine Roulette, and it was made by Lee Thompson, who went on to have sort of a meteoric career at NBC. But her contention was this. She showed a series of parents whose children were fine, then they got the whooping cough vaccine, the DPT vaccine, and then they weren't fine anymore. And you saw these children with withered arms and legs, with spastic limbs that were seizing, that were staring vacantly up at the sky, that had bicycle helmets on, that were drooling. I think anybody who was human who watched that show couldn't help but be moved by it. It was wrong. The whooping cough vaccine didn't cause permanent brain damage, but it had a tremendous fallout. It really gave birth to the notion in this country that vaccines might be doing more harm than good.
So we're talking about a debate that is now about 30 years old. Should we be thinking about the anti-vaccine movement as a purely grassroots effort, or has it become, or is it more than that today?
It's much more than that. I think certainly there are those sort of dedicated groups like the National Vaccine Information Center, which used to be called Dissatisfied Parents Together, Moms Against Mercury, Safe Minds, Generation Rescue. I mean, these are the professional anti-vaccine groups. But I think the bigger group, frankly, are just parents who've become scared. They're not sure who to trust. They're not sure what to believe. They have this vague sense that maybe pharmaceutical companies have too much influence, that maybe doctors aren't to be trusted, and they're choosing to delay or withhold one or more vaccines at their children's risk.
But there is, from the sound of it, an infrastructure out there, offices in Washington, D.C., people who make a living in the context of this movement. Is that a correct assumption?
That's a correct assumption.
Okay. Has the anti-vaccine movement targeted one particular vaccine or another, or is it a relatively global type of a focus?
It's relatively global. I certainly the vaccine that started it all, I think, from the modern American anti-vaccine movement group was clearly the whooping cough vaccine, the pertussis vaccine. I think that the vaccines that have been hardest hit have been the hepatitis B vaccine, I think in large part because it's given to children when the first day of life. The human papillomavirus vaccine, I think, has been a big target because it prevents a sexually transmitted disease, and I think at some level, people see that as dirty and don't like to give it to adolescents. I think hepatitis B vaccine suffered the same thing. So that I think there's some vaccines that suffer more than others, but I think at some level, when one suffer, they all suffer.
When did you get first involved in this 30-year debate?
I think what got me interested in this was the fact that I worked with a team at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia to develop the rotavirus vaccine. I mean, I'm a basic scientist, an immunologist, a virologist, and so that's how I grew up. That's how I was trained in all this. And for the 10 years that I worked with the group at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia to do the research that created the strains that ultimately became a licensed rotavirus vaccine, I learned about what it took to do the research. But I think the real education, frankly, came with the 15-plus years that it took to do the research of development to make that vaccine. When you see what exactly is required to get a vaccine into children, it's just daunting. I had no idea. And then when you see it so easily and wrongly dismissed by people who have really little idea of what vaccines are or how they work or how they're made, it was hard to watch.
So in essence, obviously, your awareness increased over the years. Were you called upon to speak up at some point? Was there an interview that was considered a first, congressional hearing perhaps? When did you first physically get involved in the debate?
Actually, I certainly wasn't called upon. I think that what got me in was, and nobody's ever asked me that question, but I'll tell you exactly what got me in, was there was an article in the Philadelphia Inquirer about the chickenpox vaccine, the varicella vaccine. It had just come out in 1995. And here was a vaccine that had the capacity to protect against the 10,000 hospitalizations and roughly 70 to 100 deaths that occurred from chickenpox every year. And there was an article in the Philadelphia Inquirer, actually, that sort of, it was that typical he said, she said story. Here are people, researchers at the CDC, who say this about the vaccine, which is it's safe and effective, and here's just the local guy who says it's not. And I just couldn't believe that. And I called up the reporter and I said, this is not balance. I mean, there's no perspective here. This is just not the way to cover this story. There's not two sides to this story. Do your homework. Read the original papers if you're going to comment on this. And it just made me angry that this vaccine that had been so hard worked upon was so easily dismissed by the paper, because that's where people were getting their information. It just really upset me that that's where people were going to get this information, that they wouldn't believe, that the CDC was correct in its statement that the vaccine was of value.
And was it left at the level of a phone call, or did you follow it up with an op-ed perhaps, or other advocacy efforts?
Yes, it was followed up with a letter to the editor, actually, and then I was in. I mean, then I found myself getting angrier and angrier and calling these sort of generally local reporters, and eventually Fox News, I remember, did an awful story, and I just found myself calling people and writing op-ed pieces and being angry about all this.
So you've been at it for about 15 years, based on my quick calculations, about half the duration that the controversy seems to have been swirling.
That's right.
In reading your book, you appropriately devote a significant amount of space to one of the major protagonists in the debate, Dr. Wakefield. Could you share with our viewers the role that Dr. Wakefield played and where that role has come to?
He's an interesting guy, Andrew Wakefield. I mean, what he did was he published a paper in 1998 in a general medical journal called The Lancet, which is a very well-respected journal, and it was really a case report. It was a case series of 8 children who had recently received the combination measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, or MMR vaccine. They all, according to the parents, had developed symptoms and signs of autism within a month of receiving that vaccine. He also believed that when he looked by endoscopy at their intestines, that they had something called ileal lymphoid nodular hyperplasia, which is to say swelling of groups of lymphoid tissue like the Peyer's patch or mesenteric node. That was his, so he believed he found something. He believed he'd identified an important syndrome. Get the MMR vaccine, develop intestinal symptoms, and then get autism. Now, that was wrong.
Based on 8 cases.
Based on 8 cases. And
yes.
Obviously he didn't, to his credit actually, in the discussion section of that paper, he said, I cannot say that this vaccine caused autism because this is not a controlled study. I haven't looked at large groups of children who did or didn't receive the vaccine. He did say that in the discussion section, but that was the last time he said it. I mean, the next day when the light's shining and the camera's rolling, he said exactly that he feared the MMR vaccine caused autism. Now, what's interesting about Dr. Wakefield is a few things. One is that since that study or that case series was reported, there have been many, many studies. There was about 14 really, looking at large groups of children who either did or didn't receive MMR to see whether the risk of autism was greater in the vaccinated group, and clearly it wasn't, again and again and again. What makes Dr. Wakefield interesting is that he simply holds on to this belief. It's like a religious belief, which is remarkable for a scientist, and that's why he can do so much damage. He's convincing because he's convinced. I've never seen anything like him. In many ways, though, he's actually helped, I think, the cause of trying to get good information to the public, because what has since been found out is that much of what he had published was fraudulent, that he'd misrepresented those cases.